The summer of 1878 burned hot across the Arizona territory, and in a town called Dus Creek, a woman sat inside an iron cage in the middle of the main square, waiting for a stranger she did not yet know existed. This is her story, and his. The rain fell hard that May night, 3 months before the stranger arrived. It came down in sheets, the kind of rain that turns a dirt alley into a river of mud. Behind the saloon called the Broken Spoke, a woman stood in the dark. Her name was Leona Whitaker. She was 28 years old. She was 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands calloused from a decade of working hot iron beside her husband. Her husband was dead, had been dead 4 months. Tonight, her morning dress was torn from the shoulder down to the waist. Her blonde hair hung wet against her face. In her right hand, she held a blacksmith's hammer. The hammer had belonged to her husband. She had carried it in her market basket because Dus Creek was no longer safe for a widow who walked alone. 3 men lay at her feet. They were not moving. The rain mixed with the blood. It ran in thin red rivers between the cobblestones and pooled at the mouth of the alley. At the far end of the alley, an old man stood frozen. Dr. Obadiah Thorne, 62 years old, his medical bag still in his hand. He had been walking home from a house call when he heard the screams. He had arrived in time to see everything, every single thing. He opened his mouth to speak, to call out, to do something. Then he heard the boots. Sheriff Cornelius Vance came around the corner with a lantern swinging in his fist. He was 52, thick through the middle, a badge pinned crooked on his vest. He stopped at the edge of the alley. He looked at the 3 bodies. He looked at Leona. He looked at the doctor. And in his eyes there was no horror, no pity, not even anger. There was only calculation. The slow, cold calculation of a man who has just discovered that tragedy can be turned into money if you handle it the right way. The narrator's voice, low and steady, speaks from somewhere beyond the storm. That night, Leona Whitaker saved her own life, but Dus Creek would turn her into a monster. And 3 months later, a man carrying the wounds of war would ride into this town, and he would change everything. 3 months later, August 1878, the heat pressed down on Dus Creek like a flat iron. The sky above the town was the color of old bone. No clouds, no wind, just the sun hammering down on tin roofs and dirt streets and the sweat on the backs of men's necks. In the center of the town square, where ranchers had once tied their horses, an iron cage now stood. It was square and it was tall and it was ugly. The bars were painted black, but the paint had begun to peel in the heat, showing the rust underneath. A wooden sign had been nailed to the side. The letters were crooked and painted in tar. $1 to look, $10 to touch the blacksmith's widow. Beside the cage sat a small pine table. Behind the table sat Sheriff Cornelius Vance. He had a cigar clamped between his teeth and a pile of silver coins in front of him, arranged in neat little stacks of 10. Every so often, he would lift his voice above the crowd and call out the same speech. The town council had spared her life, he would say. The iron cage was her sentence. And every coin, every nickel, every silver dollar went to build the new schoolhouse for the children, for the future. It was a lie. There was no schoolhouse being built. The coins went into a leather pouch under the table. At the end of each day, the pouch went into the sheriff's saddlebag, and the sheriff went home to count his money alone. But the people of Dus Creek wanted to believe the lie. It made the cruelty feel like charity. Inside the cage, Leona Whitaker sat on a plank of wood. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on a small crack in the ground 6 inches from her boots. She had been staring at that crack for 3 months. She knew every curve of it. She had named it, though she had never said the name aloud. She did not look up when the children came. A boy of about 10 years old pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He had a stone in his fist. His father lifted him onto his shoulders and whispered something in his ear. The boy threw the stone. It struck the iron bars with a sharp clang. The crowd laughed. The father ruffled his son's hair and told him he was a brave little man. Leona did not blink. Her hands did not move. At the edge of the square, a little girl named Emma Whitley tugged on her mother's dress. She was 7 years old. Her eyes were wide and wet. "Mama," she whispered, "why do they do that to her?" Her mother did not answer. She only looked away and pulled the child along by the wrist. Across the square in the doorway of the doctor's office, Dr. Obadiah Thorne stood holding a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. His old hand trembled. He watched the cage the way a man watches his own grave being dug. He had watched it every day for 3 months. He had never once come closer than 50 feet. He knew what he had seen that night. He knew what he had failed to say, and the knowing was eating him alive one slow hour at a time. This was Dus Creek in the summer of 1878, and from the east along the Ridge Road, a single rider was coming. His name was Elias Hargrove. He was 33 years old. He rode a tired bay horse with dust caked into its mane. His hat was pulled low. His coat was gray with road dirt. He had 4 days of stubble on his jaw and the kind of eyes that had already buried too much. Ohio was his home once, a white house on a green hill, a mother who read to him from the book of Matthew by candlelight, a father who died at Shiloh when Elias was 14 years old, a rifle on the mantelpiece, a brother buried in the same cold ground as the father. He had gone to war at 18, the 8th Ohio Infantry. He had fought at Antietam. He had fought at Chancellorsville. He had lain 3 days at Gettysburg beside the bodies of men he had known by name. He had come home when it was over. He had married the neighbor girl, Adeline Mason, who used to bring cornbread to his mother when his mother was sick. Adeline had a laugh like a bell. Adeline had made him believe the world could still be a soft place. Then the cholera came through the valley. He remembered the night he rode for the doctor. The road was mud to the knees. The horse went down twice. He made it to town and he made it back. And when he opened the door, Adeline was already gone. The baby she had been carrying was already gone. 2 lives in one night. He had buried them together in one grave. He did not know what else to do. And that same night he had taken his mother's old Bible and he had laid it on the fire in the hearth. He had not been losing his faith. He had been furious with it. He had been furious with the gun who had let a girl with a laugh like a bell die screaming while her husband was out riding through the mud. 2 years had passed since that night. He had drifted, cattle drives, freight escorts, any job that moved him west further from the grave. Now he rode into Dus Creek only to buy flour and coffee and some dried meat. He would be gone by nightfall. He was making for his grandfather's old homestead in the Colorado high country, 40 acres and a cabin with a leaking roof. It was all he had left in the world, and it would be enough. He was not looking for trouble. He was not looking for anything at all. But when he rode into the square, he heard the crowd. He saw the cage, and something in the back of his old soldier's brain told him to stop. He stopped. He dismounted slow, the way a tired man dismounts. He looped the reins over a post. He pushed his hat back an inch. Then he walked not fast to the edge of the crowd. He did not look at the sign first. He looked at the woman in the cage. She was tall. Even sitting, he could see that. Her shoulders were wide. Her hair, where it had escaped the loose braid, was the color of wheat in late August. Her dress had once been black. 3 months of sun had beaten it to gray. She did not move. A drunk pushed past Elias's shoulder, laughing, waving a crumpled dollar. $10 to touch her, he was shouting. $10, and she can't even lay a hand on you. Come on, boys, who's man enough? And that was when Leona Whitaker lifted her head. It was only for a moment, only a second. She swept her eyes across the crowd, not looking for anyone, just reminding herself that she was still a person. Her eyes were pale, pale as winter skeevy, and her eyes found Elias Hargrove. He did not look away. He could not, because in that woman's face he saw himself, 2 years ago, sitting in the mud beside his wife's grave. A man whose body was still walking around even though everything inside him had already died. His hand tightened on his belt until the knuckles went white. She has already died, he thought. Her body just doesn't know it yet. And something in him that had been asleep for 2 long years opened one eye. He looked away from her, not because he wanted to, but because he needed to think. He listened to the crowd. He caught the pieces of the story. A blacksmith's widow, 3 men dead in an alley, a trial, a cage instead of a rope, the schoolhouse that was never going to be built. Elias Hargrove had been a soldier. He had looked into the faces of killers. He had looked into the faces of men who had done terrible things and slept well afterward. He knew what that face looked like. He had seen it in 100 saloons from Missouri to Nevada. The woman in the cage did not have that face, not even close. The woman in the cage had the face of someone who had been drowning and who had finally stopped kicking and who was now simply waiting for the water to finish its work. And Elias Hargrove, who had not been able to pray for 2 years, heard a voice in his head. It was his mother's voice. She was reading from Matthew, the 25th chapter. She was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire. He was 8 years old. She was telling him that whatever he did for the least of these, he did for the Lord himself. He had not thought of that verse in a decade. He looked at the sheriff's table. He looked at the piles of silver. He looked at the sign. He looked at the woman. And then he walked slow and sure across the square. Her name had been Leona Brightwell once. She was 22 years old the day she met him. It was the spring of 1872, at the Harvest Fair in Kansas City. She was standing at her father's booth, selling horseshoes, and she was a full head taller than most of the men who walked past. She had grown up being laughed at for her height. She had grown up learning to fold her shoulders inward to make herself smaller, the way a tall woman in a small world must learn to do. A young blacksmith stopped at the booth. His name was Barnabas Whitaker, but everyone called him Barney. He had shoulders like a barn door and a smile that reached his eyes before it reached his mouth. He picked up one of her father's horseshoes. He turned it in his big hands. He looked up at her. He did not look up at her the way men looked up at tall women. He looked up the way a man looks at a sunrise. A woman tall as you, he said, must be a woman strong as you. That's a beautiful thing. She had not known what to say. Nobody had ever called her beautiful before. Nobody had ever said the word strong and the word beautiful in the same breath about her. They were married 6 months later. They moved to Dus Creek and opened a blacksmith shop on the edge of town. Barney taught her to work iron. He taught her to shoe horses, to bend nails, to temper steel in cold water. Her hands, which had been large all her life, and which had always been a source of shame, became the hands of a craftswoman. And when she looked down at them, she was proud. 6 years of that life. 6 years of the ringing of the hammer on the anvil. 6 years of the smell of charcoal and hot iron. 6 years of Barney's voice calling her his warrior, his wife, his gift from God. Then in the winter of 1877, Barney began to cough. The cough got worse. One morning, blood came with it. Consumption, the doctor said. She nursed him for 3 months. The shop stayed closed. Customers stopped coming. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid the door. Money ran out. She did not leave his side. On a night in January with snow falling past the window, Barney held her hand in his own two hands. His voice was almost gone. He said, "Leona, you are a gift from God. Do not ever let anyone tell you your strength makes you less. Promise me." She promised. He died at sunrise. She buried him alone on a hill outside town. The ground was frozen. It took her a full day to dig the grave. 3 men offered to help. She turned all 3 away. "This," she said, "is the last thing I will do for my husband with my own hands." 3 weeks later, the creditors came. Barney had borrowed $200 before the illness to buy a new forge. He had meant to pay it back from the summer's work. The summer's work had never come. She sold the shop. She sold the house. She moved into a rented room above the dry goods store. She kept one thing only, Barney's hammer. She carried that hammer with her everywhere after that. Because without Barney in the shop, Dus Creek had become a different town for her. The looks on the street had changed. The things men said under their breath had changed. A widow who stood 6 feet tall and had no man to stand beside her was a strange kind of target. She could feel it. She was right. The night of May 14th, 1878. The rain came down hard. Leona had walked to the dry goods store to buy a bolt of black cloth. She needed to sew a new morning dress. Her only one had begun to fall apart. The store was closing. She walked out with the cloth wrapped in oilskin under her arm. She pulled her shawl tight over her head. She turned for home. The quickest way home was through the alley behind the broken spoke. She heard them before she saw them. Laughter, 3 voices. Men who had been drinking since noon. Men who had nothing to lose and nobody watching. Rufus Kincaid stepped out of the back door first. He was 35. He was also the first cousin of Sheriff Cornelius Vance. Behind him came Grover Pembleton, who was 40 and who had been married 3 times. Behind him came Mordecai Flint, who was 32, and who had a reputation men did not speak aloud in front of women. "Well now," said Rufus Kincaid, "look at this, the giant widow all by herself." She turned to go back. Grover Pembleton stepped behind her and closed the mouth of the alley. Mordecai Flint pulled a knife from his belt. "Barney's been gone 4 months now," said Rufus. "A woman needs warming, don't she? We thought we'd do her the favor." She said, "Let me pass." They did not let her pass. Rufus Kincaid reached for her shoulder. He caught the cloth of her dress at the seam. He pulled. The fabric tore from shoulder to waist. Grover Pembleton grabbed the braid of her hair. The knife in Mordecai Flint's hand came up, and in her market basket, wrapped in a scrap of burlap, was Barnabas Whitaker's blacksmith hammer. What happened next took 30 seconds. She would never remember it as 30 seconds. In her memory, it would always feel both longer and shorter than that, like a dream you cannot wake from. When it was over, the rain was still falling. The 3 men were lying in the mud. The hammer had fallen from her hand. She stood in the alley, shaking. At the far end, she saw him, Dr. Obadiah Thorne, black bag in his hand, still, silent, watching. He took 1 step toward her. Then the sheriff's boots came down the alley, and the doctor stopped walking, and the rest of Leona Whitaker's life began to be written by other people. Sheriff Cornelius Vance had 3 things to think about in that moment. The first was that one of the dead men was his cousin. The second was that Dr. Thorne had seen the whole thing and the doctor could not be allowed to speak. The third was that this whole situation, properly handled, could become a source of income for a very long time. He pulled the doctor aside. He whispered, He reminded the doctor of something that had happened 15 years ago during the war. A Confederate deserter the doctor had treated in secret. A man the doctor should have turned over to the Union Army. Evidence the sheriff had kept locked in his desk for more than a decade, waiting for a day just like this. When Dr. Thorne looked up, his eyes were empty. He would say only what the sheriff told him to say. The rest he would carry to his grave. That was the bargain. The trial was 2 days later. The town council had 5 members. 3 of them owed the sheriff money. The sheriff himself acted as prosecutor. Leona's court-appointed defender was the sheriff's nephew. He told her that if she spoke about the attack, the jury would say she was lying to save her neck. He told her silence was her only friend. Dr. Obadiah Thorne took the stand. His hands shook. He said, "I saw Mrs. Whitaker standing over 3 dead men. Her hammer was in her hand. The hammer had blood on it." He did not say anything about the torn dress. He did not say anything about the bruises on her neck. He did not say what 3 drunk men had said about her husband or what they had meant to do. The council conferred for 19 minutes. The rope was ruled out. The sheriff was afraid of Barney's kin in Kansas. They decided on a cage. They decided on a saddlin. They decided on a schoolhouse that would never be built. And from that afternoon on for 3 months, Leona Whitaker did not speak a single word. Not to the sheriff, not to the children, not to her own reflection in the tin cup of water they passed her through the bars. She sat. She stared at the crack in the ground. She ate when they fed her. She drank when they let her. She became to the people of Dus Creek a piece of furniture that had once been a woman. And 3 months passed. And on an afternoon in August, a stranger rode in from the east. He walked up to the sheriff's table and he looked down at the piles of coins and he said the words that nobody in Dus Creek had ever thought to hear. "How much," said Elias Hargrove, "to buy this woman from you?" The sheriff's cigar paused halfway to his mouth. He laughed. It was a short, ugly laugh. "She ain't a slave cowboy. She's a prisoner." Elias Hargrove opened the leather pouch at his belt. He poured $100 in gold pieces onto the pine table. The coins flashed yellow in the afternoon sun. "I will pay," he said, "whatever you want. Let her go." The crowd, which had been roaring a moment before, went very still. A woman at the back whispered something to her husband. A child began to cry and was hushed. The silence spread outward in a circle like a stone dropped in still water. Sheriff Cornelius Vance looked at the gold. He looked at the stranger. He opened his mouth to name a price. But before the price could come out, a young man's voice cut across the square. "Pa!" The sheriff turned. Every head in the crowd turned with him. A boy of 19 had stepped out of the crowd. His name was Jasper Vance. He was the sheriff's only son. He had been working cattle at a ranch 5 miles out, and he had only come home that weekend because a stranger in a stagecoach had told him about the iron cage in his hometown square. He had not believed it. He had come to see for himself. Now he was seeing it. He walked past his father's table without looking at him. He walked to the cage. He looked in through the bars at Leona Whitaker. He saw her torn hands. He saw the hollow under her eyes. He saw the crack in the ground that she had been memorizing for 3 months. Then he turned around. "Pa," he said, "is this what you've been doing for 3 months? This is how you're building the schoolhouse." The sheriff's face went red. "Go home, Jasper." The boy did not go home. He turned to the stranger, to this dust-covered man with the gray eyes and the sad mouth, and he said, "Mister, where will you take her? Will you protect her?" Elias Hargrove looked back at him. "I will," he said, "on my honor." The boy nodded once, then he turned back to his father. "Pa, If you do not let her out, I will ride to Phoenix tomorrow morning. I will tell the territorial governor what you have done here." The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun, but before his fingers closed on the grip, a voice from the crowd said, "The boy is right, Cornelius. It was old Arthur Pike the carpenter. 3 months," he said. "It's been 3 months. It's enough." Then another voice, Ruth Collins, who ran the dry goods store. "I will not have my daughter grow up in a town that keeps a cage in its square." And another and another. The sheriff looked at the gold on his table. He looked at his son. He looked at the faces of the people he had been lying to for 3 months, and he saw the lie coming apart in front of him. He was a greedy man, but he was not a stupid one. He would cut his losses. He would take the gold and let the woman walk. $500, he said, for the town, not for me. It was a lie. The crowd knew it was a lie, but the crowd also knew that it did not matter anymore. What mattered was the key. Elias Hargrove counted out $500 in gold. The coins made a small, ringing music as they hit the table. The sheriff reached for the keyring at his belt. And that was when Leona Whitaker, who had not spoken a word in 3 months, spoke. "I did not," she said, "kill them for no reason." Her voice was cracked. Her voice was rough. Her voice was the sound of a door that had not been opened in a long, long time. Every head in the square turned toward the cage. She told them about the alley. She told them plainly. She did not cry. She did not beg. She told them about what 3 drunk men had said to her and what they had tried to do and what had been in her basket that night. And at the end of the telling, she lifted her chin and she spoke one name. Dr. Thorne, she said, was standing at the end of that alley. And across the square, in the doorway of his office, the old man dropped his tin cup. The coffee ran dark across the boards. He walked out into the sun. He walked across the square. He walked past the sheriff. He knelt in the dirt in front of the cage. He was crying the way old men cry, silent and ashamed. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "forgive me. I was a coward." Then he stood up. He turned around. And he faced the town, and for the next 4 minutes, in a thin, trembling voice, Dr. Obadiah Thorne told them the truth. All of it. The bruises, the torn dress, the sheriff in the alley, the bargain he had been forced to make. When he was done, nobody moved. Some of the townspeople turned away. Some of them stared at the ground. Emma Whitley's mother put her hands over her face and began to cry. The sheriff unlocked the cage. The door swung open. Leona Whitaker did not walk out at once. She sat on her plank. She looked at the stranger who had just spent $500 in gold on a woman he had never met. And she asked him one word. Why Elias Hargrove walked up the wooden platform around the cage. He stopped just outside the open door. He did not enter. He did not reach for her. He went down on one knee, not to her, but just outside the threshold out of respect for the space that was still hers alone. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out something small and gold. It was his grandmother's wedding ring. He had been carrying it in that pocket for 2 years and 1 month. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I do not know you, but I know what it is to bury the person you love and keep on breathing. I know the loneliness of a man who has forgotten how to pray. I am not asking you out of pity. I am asking you because I believe that 2 people who have been left behind might build something together. If you will have me." Leona opened her mouth to answer. She never got to answer because from a rooftop on the far side of the square, a rifle cracked. The bullet passed through the crown of Elias Hargrove's hat. It clipped a lock of hair above his ear. It buried itself in the wooden post behind him with a dull thud. And from that rooftop in the hot August afternoon, a young man's voice rang down across Dus Creek. "She killed my brother, and the story, which had only just begun, began again. The rifle cracked a second time. The bullet tore a chunk of wood from the post beside Elias Hargrove's head. Splinters flew. A woman in the crowd screamed. Emma Whitley's mother pulled the child to the ground and covered her with her own body. Elias moved the way old soldiers move when the shooting starts. No panic, no wasted motion. He drew his Colt and he came up sideways between the cage and the sheriff's table, putting his body between the rifle on the rooftop and the woman in the door of the cage. Leona Whitaker had not moved. She stood in the open cage door, one hand still on the iron bar, and she looked up at the rooftop. She did not flinch at the second shot. 3 months in the cage had taught her that flinching did not change what was coming. Elias fired once. The bullet struck the roof tile 2 feet from the shooter's head. The shooter ducked. They heard his boots on the shingles. Then the sound of a man dropping into an alley on the far side of the building. Then the hoofbeats of a horse already saddled, already waiting, already running north out of Dus Creek. Sheriff Cornelius Vance stood frozen beside his pine table. His hand was on his gun. He had not drawn it. Jasper Vance turned to his father with a look on his young face that the sheriff had never seen before. It was not respect. It was not fear. It was something colder than either of those things. "You could have stopped him," Jasper said. "You did not try." The sheriff did not answer. Elias Hargrove holstered his pistol. He turned back to the woman in the cage. His hat had fallen off. A single thin line of blood ran from above his ear where the splinter had cut him. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "we have to leave now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped out of the cage. The shooter was a boy of 24 years old. His name was Silas Kincaid. He was the younger brother of Rufus Kincaid, the man who had first put his hand on Leona Whitaker's dress in the alley behind the broken spoke. Silas had not been in Dus Creek that May. Silas had been far to the south with the United States 6th Infantry Riding Patrol out of Fort Bowie against the Apache bands that still slipped across the Mexican border. Silas had enlisted at 18. By 24, he had killed 3 men in the line of duty, and he had learned the particular kind of quiet that settles into a young man who has used his rifle on another human being. He had loved his brother Rufus, or he had loved the Rufus he remembered. The Rufus who had taught him to ride. The Rufus who had put a silver dollar in his hand the morning he marched off to the army and had said, "Look after yourself, little brother. Come home when you can." When the letter came into Fort Bowie telling him Rufus was dead killed by a blacksmith's widow in an alley, Silas Kincaid had gone to his captain that same night. He had asked for discharge. He had 5 months of service left. The captain was a fair man. He signed the papers. Silas rode north for 3 weeks. He arrived in Dus Creek 10 days before Elias Hargrove did. He rented a room above the livery stable. He paid in advance. He watched the cage from his window every morning and every evening. He watched the woman sit on her plank and stare at the ground. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He told himself he was giving her the dignity of not being shot inside a cage. What he was really doing, though, he did not know it yet, was waiting for something to change his mind. When he saw the stranger kneel down in front of the cage, something in Silas Kincaid broke. He could not put a name to what broke. He only knew that the moment had come, and that if he did not pull the trigger now, he never would. He pulled the trigger. He missed. He pulled it again. He missed again. And then he ran. Because somewhere deep inside him, beneath the army training and the grief and the loyalty to a brother he barely remembered, Silas Kincaid was glad he had missed. Jasper Vance slipped into the house behind the sheriff's office through the kitchen door. He was not gone long. He came back across the square, carrying something wrapped in a saddle blanket. He handed the bundle up to Elias, who was already mounted with Leona behind him on the same horse. It was a Winchester lever-action rifle, 14 rounds in the magazine, a box of cartridges wrapped in oilcloth. "You will need it," Jasper said. Elias looked down at the boy. "Come with us." Jasper shook his head. "No, I stay. This town needs to change. If I leave, who will hold my father to account?" Elias slid the rifle into the saddle scabbard. He reached down and he shook the young man's hand. "There is a place called Silver Valley," he said, "in the Colorado high country. My grandfather's homestead. The Hargrove place. If you ever need it, it is yours. You ride up there and you say my name." Jasper nodded. He stepped back. Dr. Obadiah Thorne came across the square, then slow and stiff, his medical bag in his hand. He reached up to Leona and he pressed something into her palm. A small brown bottle of tonic and a folded letter. The letter sealed with red wax. "Tonic is for your strength," he said. 3 months in that cage. Your body needs building up. Take a spoonful, morning and night." Leona closed her fingers around the bottle. The letter said, "The doctor is my sworn testimony." Signed, dated. What I saw that night, all of it. If anything happens to me, that letter goes to a United States Marshal. Leona did not speak. She looked at the old man for a long time. Then very slightly she nodded. Once. It was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was something she did not yet know how to give. But it was the beginning of the possibility of forgiveness. And the old doctor, who had not expected even that much, wept into his gray mustache. They turned the horse. They started out of the square at a walk. Little Emma Whitley stood at the edge of the boardwalk, her mother still holding her tight around the shoulders. She lifted one small hand and she waved. Ruth Collins, in the doorway of the dry goods store, bowed her head. A farmer took off his hat. Another man looked at the ground and kept looking. The sheriff did not look at them at Borchelon. And Jasper Vance stood in the middle of the dusty street until they crested the low hill at the north end of town and passed out of sight. When the last buildings of Dus Creek fell away behind them, Leona Whitaker turned her head and she looked back. Not at the town, past the roofs and the steeple, to the low brown hill east of the cemetery where a plain wooden marker stood alone in the sun. Her lips moved. "Barney," she whispered, "forgive me. I cannot take you with me." And then more quietly, words she had not spoken in 3 months. "Lord," she whispered, "if you are still listening, help me to walk forward. I do not know where I am going, but I have to go." They rode 15 miles that afternoon. The land rose slowly out of the flat country around Dus Creek and began to break into low red hills dotted with juniper and scrub pine. The sun went down behind the western ridges in a long, flat bar of orange. The first stars came out. Elias made camp by a dry creek bed. He unsaddled the horse. He rubbed the animal down with a twist of grass. He built a small fire of mesquite wood, low and careful, the way a man builds a fire when he does not want to be seen from far away. Leona sat on a flat rock about 6 feet from the fire. Not close, not far. She held the brown bottle of tonic in her lap like a small brown child. Elias boiled coffee in a tin pot. He brought her a cup. He set it on the ground between them and stepped back before she could be startled. He handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried beef. She took them without looking up. She chewed slowly, very slowly. 3 months of cage rations had shrunk her stomach. She knew that if she ate too fast, she would be sick. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked. A coyote called from somewhere to the north, long and thin. Another answered far off. Then Elias said, "I am going to tell you about myself. So you know who paid for your freedom." He did not look at her while he talked. He looked at the fire. He told her about his mother, a farmhouse in Ohio, the book of Matthew by candlelight, a father who had been a farmer and a lay preacher and who had marched off in 1861 with the 8th Ohio. A letter that came in the spring of 1862 saying the father had died at a place called Shiloh. A brother 2 years older who had enlisted in his father's place and who had died at Chickamauga the next year. He told her about his own war. He had gone at 18. He had fought at Antietam. He had fought at Chancellorsville. At Gettysburg, he had lain 3 days among the wounded, the dead, and the dying before the ambulances came. A piece of shell had gone through his left thigh. He still had the scar. He told her about coming home, about Adeline Mason, the neighbor girl who had brought cornbread to his mother during his mother's last illness, about the quiet wedding in the small white church on the hill, about the farmhouse they had built with their own hands, about the child she was carrying. He told her about the night the cholera came. He told her about the grave he had dug in the rain, 2 bodies, 1 grave, a wooden marker he had carved himself with a pocket knife. He told her about the Bible on the fire. I was not losing my faith, he said. I was furious with it. I was furious with him. I had asked him for one thing. I had asked him to let her live, and he had said no. For 2 years, he said, I could not pray. I could not read the word. I could not walk into a church without my throat closing up. He stopped. He poked the fire with the stick. A shower of sparks went up into the dark. Leona Whitaker lifted her head. For the first time since they had left Dus Creek, she looked straight at him. Her eyes caught the firelight, and they were the color of very old silver. My husband, she said, my Barney. On the night he died, he told me I was a gift from God. He said it just like that, a gift from God. She took a slow breath. I believed him. For a little while, I believed that there was a maker who had shaped me the way I was shaped on purpose, that my height was not a curse, that my strong hands were not a punishment. She looked down at her hands in her lap. They were large. They were scarred. They were still steady. Then 3 men met me in an alley, she said, and they said things about what they intended to do to me. And my hands, which had been made for my husband's forge, were used to kill 3 human beings. She lifted her eyes back to him. If I am a gift from God, she said, then who did God give me to the 3 men in the alley so they could die? Elias did not answer at once. He did not answer because he did not have the answer. He had not had the answer for 2 years. Finally, he said, I do not know, Mrs. Whitaker. I am not a man who has answers anymore. She nodded once. I do not need an answer, she said. I only need to go somewhere that does not have a cage in the middle of it. The fire ticked. Then Elias Hargrove said, quiet almost to himself, Adeline used to tell me something. She said, faith is not knowing the answer. Faith is walking on even when you do not. He looked at Leona. I forgot that he said, for 2 years I forgot, but maybe that is why the Lord put me on the road through Dus Creek this afternoon. Maybe he wanted me to remember. Leona did not answer, but she stood up from her flat rock, and she walked slow and careful 3 steps closer to the fire, and she sat back down, and she did not look at him. But she was closer. It was enough. For that night it was enough. They rode for 3 days, north and east toward the Mogollon Rim. The country grew harder and rockier. Water got scarcer. On the morning of the 4th day, they entered a narrow pass between 2 high walls of red sandstone. The walls rose up on either side 100 feet. The pass itself was 20 feet wide at the bottom. There was no cover. There was no way around. Elias Hargrove felt the back of his neck go cold. 20 years of soldiering had taught him what a killing ground looked like. This was one. He knew it the moment the shadow of the walls fell across his face. He tried to turn the horse. He tried to back it out of the pass. He was too late. The first rifle shot came down from the ridge on the right. It caught the horse in the thick muscle of the neck. The animal screamed and reared. Elias and Leona were both thrown. Elias hit the ground on his right shoulder and rolled. Leona hit the ground flat on her back and the wind went out of her. The second shot went over their heads and struck the far wall. The horse went down on its side, kicked twice, and lay still. Elias Hargrove crawled for the rifle scabbard. The Winchester was pinned under the horse. He could not get it free. His own pistol had come out of the holster when he fell. It lay in the dust 6 feet away. Silas Kincaid came down off the ridge slowly. He had a Sharp's carbine in his hands. He was thin in the face. There were dark circles under his eyes like bruises. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 days. He stopped 20 feet from them. He pointed the carbine at Leona. "Stand up," he said. She got to her feet. The wind was still knocked out of her. Her knees shook, but she stood. "Stand up," he said again. "I want to see your face when I do it." "I am standing," she said. "Look." Elias dragged himself toward his pistol. Silas heard the movement. He turned the carbine and he fired once. The bullet hit Elias in the meat of the left thigh, almost exactly where the shell fragment had hit him at Gettysburg 15 years before. Elias went down with a grunt and did not try to crawl any further. Silas turned the carbine back on Leona, and then Leona Whitaker did something that nobody in Dus Creek would have believed. She walked toward him. She walked 3 steps, 4, 5, until she was standing directly between Silas Kincaid and Elias Hargrove. She opened her arms wide. She made her body a shield. Her voice when she spoke was calm, almost gentle. "Silas," she said, "you are Silas Kincaid." "Yes." The boy's eyes went wide. He had not expected his name. "I remember you," she said. "You came to my husband's shop when you were 16 years old. You wanted him to teach you how to make a sword." Barney laughed and he said that nobody needs a sword in this century. "But he taught you how to make a hunting knife instead. Do you remember that the barrel of the carbine dropped 3 inches? Silas Kincaid's hands began to shake. "I remember," he said. "You were a good boy," she said. "You were polite. You called my husband sir. He liked you. He said you would make a fine man someday." She took a breath. "Your brother Rufus," she said. "I need to tell you the truth about your brother. I am sorry that I am the one who has to tell it to you." Silas's jaw tightened. His finger was still on the trigger. "On the night of May 14th, said Leona, your brother and 2 other men cornered me in an alley behind the Broken Spoke Saloon. They said things that no man should say to any woman. They tore my dress. They put their hands on me. What they intended I will not speak aloud because you are a young man and you do not need those words in your head." She did not cry. Her voice did not rise. "Dr. Obadiah Thorne was standing at the end of that alley," she said. "He saw it. He saw every part of it. He was forced to lie at my trial. A few days ago in the square at Dus Creek, he stood up in front of the whole town and he told the truth. He signed a letter. I have it with me." The carbine dropped another 3 inches. "If you do not believe me," she said, "ride back to Dus Creek. Ask little Emma Whitley. Ask Ruth Collins, who keeps the dry goods store. Ask Jasper Vance, the sheriff's son. Every one of them heard Dr. Thorne speak. And if after you have asked them you still believe I am lying, then you come and find me. And I will stand still and you can put your bullet where you wish. I will not run." Silas Kincaid did not move. From the dust, Elias Hargrove spoke. His voice was thick with pain, but steady. "Son," he said, "I was at Gettysburg. I have looked into the eyes of killers. I know what that looks like. That woman is not a killer, and neither are you. Do not do a thing that will stay with you until the day you die." The carbine came down. Silas Kincaid dropped to his knees in the red dust, and then he put his face in his hands. And he wept. He wept the way a small boy weeps when he has lost something he cannot get back. He wept for the older brother he had remembered as a hero, and for the older brother he had just learned to see as something else. He wept for the letter he would never write to his mother explaining what Rufus had truly been. Leona Whitaker walked over to him. She did not touch him. She sat down in the dust beside him, an arm's length away, and she waited. When he was able to speak again, he looked up at her. His face was streaked with dirt and tears. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I came here to kill you. What do I do now?" Now she said, "You help me get my husband up off this ground." She had said, "my husband." She did not know at that moment that she had said it. She had meant the man bleeding in the dust. She had meant Elias. The word had come out of her mouth without her permission. And when she heard it in the air between them, she did not take it back. Silas Kincaid looked at Elias, then at Leona. Then he stood up. Together they lifted Elias Hargrove out of the red dust. Leona tore strips from the hem of her dress and bound his thigh tight in above and below the wound. Silas brought water from his canteen. The bullet had gone clean through. That was a mercy, but the bleeding was bad and the leg was swelling fast. Elias's horse was dead. Silas's horse was hidden a quarter-mile back up the pass. They got Elias onto Silas's horse. Silas walked. Leona walked. The three of them came out of the pass together as the sun was going down. The town of Pine Hollow lay 2 days north in the pine country, just over the New Mexico line. Silas had been through Pine Hollow once when he was a boy. His mother had a friend there, an old widow. Her name was Prudence Merriweather, and she ran a small boarding house on the north end of the town. They arrived at dusk on the second day. Elias was burning with fever. Silas and Leona walked on either side of the horse, holding him up in the saddle so he would not fall. Widow Prudence Merriweather opened the door of her boarding house. She was 56 years old. She had silver hair pinned up on her head and a black dress with a white collar. She had not been expecting company. She looked at Leona, tall, torn dress, a face caked with dust and dried tears. She looked at Elias in the saddle, pale and trembling with fever. She looked at Silas, a young man with a rifle on his back and red eyes. Widow Merriweather did not ask any questions. "Come inside," she said. "I will put the water on." Dr. Nathaniel Brooks of Pine Hollow took the bullet out that same night. He did not need to take it out because it had gone through, but he cleaned the wound and packed it with clean cloth and whiskey. He said the wound would heal if the fever broke. He said it would not heal if the fever did not break. For 3 days and 3 nights, the fever did not break. Leona Whitaker did not leave the bedside. She sat in a straight-back chair beside the bed. She wrung out cloths and cool water, and she laid them on Elias Hargrove's forehead. She spooned broth between his cracked lips when she could. She prayed. She had not prayed in 3 months, and now she could not stop. On the 3rd night, Elias began to talk. He was not awake. The fever had taken him deep. He spoke the names of men he had known in the war. He spoke the name of his mother's, and over, between the other names, he spoke one name, Adeline. "Adeline, our boy," he said to the dark ceiling. "Did you name our boy?" Leona Whitaker sat in the chair beside the bed, and she listened. She was not jealous. She did not have room in her heart for jealousy. The man on the bed was burning alive, calling out to the woman he had buried in the Ohio rain 2 years before, and Leona understood. She understood better than anyone alive. Widow Prudence Merriweather came in once with fresh water. She stood in the doorway, and she watched Leona take Elias's hand and hold it between her own two hands. Prudence Merriweather did not say a word. She set the water down, she left the room, and she closed the door gently behind her. In the small hours of that third night, with a single candle burning on the bedside table, Leona Whitaker leaned close to the sick man's ear, and she whispered the things she had come to say. Adeline, she whispered, if you can hear me, I do not know if the dead can hear the living, but I think maybe they can. I need you to know something. I am not trying to take your place. I could not take your place. Nobody could. She took a breath. But your Elias is alone, she said, and I am alone, and we have found each other on the road. I do not know yet if I love him. I do not know yet if he loves me. But if the day comes that we do love each other, I want you to know that I will not love him less than you did. I will only love him beside you. And if I ever meet you on the other side, Adeline Hargrove, I hope that you will forgive me for loving your husband, and I hope that you will tell me about your boy. The candle flickered. Elias's breathing changed. His skin, which had been dry and hot for 3 days, began to glisten. The fever broke just before dawn. On the fourth morning, Elias Hargrove opened his eyes. He did not know where he was. The ceiling was made of pine boards. There was a window with a white curtain. There was a pitcher of water on the stand beside the bed. There was a woman asleep in a chair. Her head had fallen forward. Her blonde hair had come loose from its braid. Her large hands were folded in her lap. She was still holding his hand between them, even in her sleep. He watched her for a long time before he spoke. Mrs. Whitaker, he said at last. She came awake all at once. She did not let go of his hand. Mr. Hargrove, she said. You were praying, he said. I could hear you, through the fever. Yes, I did not think you prayed. I did not, she said. For a while, he smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen on his face. It was a tired smile, and it was a faint one. But it was real. Adeline used to tell me, he said, that when the body is sick, prayer is the only medicine the Lord wrote himself. I had forgotten that too. He closed his eyes again. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, yes, when I am strong enough. Will you still have me? She did not answer with words. She lifted his hand to her cheek. She held it there. She closed her eyes and she felt his pulse against her skin. That was her answer. Elias Hargrove slept most of the next 2 days. He woke only to drink broth, to swallow the tonic Dr. Brooks had left, and to look across the small pine-board room for Leona, who was always there. On the third afternoon, Widow Merriweather came into the room with a tray. There was soup on the tray and bread and a small blue pitcher of milk. Behind her in the doorway stood an old man in a black coat. His hair was white. His eyes were the soft blue of the kind of sky that follows a long storm. He carried a worn leather Bible under his left arm. This is Reverend Ezra Lancaster, said Prudence Merriweather. He asked if he might sit with you a little while, if you are strong enough. Elias looked at the old man. Then he looked at Leona. Leona nodded, very small. I am strong enough, said Elias. Widow Merriweather left them. Leona started to rise from her chair. Stay, said Elias, please. She sat back down. Reverend Lancaster pulled up the second chair and sat with the Bible balanced on his knees. He did not open it. He did not speak right away. He only looked at Elias Hargrove for a long, quiet moment. Son, he said at last, your wife has told me some of your story. I am not here to preach. I am 70 this coming Easter. I am too tired to preach at a man in a sick bed. I have only come to tell you one thing, and then I will go. All right, said Elias. The Reverend opened his hand on top of the Bible. I was a chaplain in the war, he said. 5th Pennsylvania Infantry. I marched with them for 3 years. I was at Antietam on the 17th of September, 1862. You know what happened that day. Elias nodded. He knew. 23,000 men fallen in a single day, the bloodiest single day in the history of the Republic. I prayed, said Reverend Lancaster, over 200 dying boys in the space of 12 hours. 200. I held their hands while they asked for their mothers. I closed their eyes. And when the sun went down behind the cornfield at Sharpsburg, I walked to Antietam Creek and I took my Bible out of my haversack and I threw it as far as I could throw it into the water. He paused. He looked out the window. I was not losing my faith, he said. I was furious with it. Leona's hands went still in her lap. The next morning, said the Reverend, I walked down to the creek at first light. I did not go down there to pray. I went down there to see whether my Bible had floated away or sunk. He smiled. It was a small, crooked smile. It had not floated away, he said. It had not sunk. It had lodged in the roots of an old sycamore at the edge of the water. The cover was wet through. Half the pages were stuck together. But it had not been carried off. And as I stood there looking at it, a thing came into my mind that has stayed with me for 16 years now. What? Said Elias quietly. A man who has no faith at all, said Reverend Lancaster, does not bother to be furious with God. He does not throw a Bible into a creek. He shrugs and he walks away, and he does not think about the Lord again. To be furious with God is a form of faith. It is the form faith takes when faith has been broken open. But it is still faith. The door has not closed. The rope has not been cut. He leaned forward. He put the old Bible into Elias Hargrove's hands. This one, he said, is that same Bible. I fished it out of Antietam Creek the next morning. I dried the pages on a fence rail. I have carried it ever since. It is not a pretty book. The ink has run. There are pages you can barely read, but it is still the Word. Elias's hands closed around the Bible. They were shaking. I am not asking you to open it, said the Reverend. Not today, not this week, not this year. I am only asking you to keep it. When you are ready to open it, the Lord will let you know. Reverend Lancaster stood up slowly. Your wife tells me, he said from the doorway, that the two of you intend to be married. Yes, said Leona. When this man can walk, said Reverend Lancaster, you come down to my church. I will do the office. It will be my honor. And he left them there in the small room with an old wet Bible on Elias Hargrove's lap. Elias held the Bible for a long time. He did not open it. He only held it. His thumb traced the shape of the cross pressed into the worn leather of the cover. When he looked up at Leona, his eyes were wet. He called you my wife, he said, out loud. Just now, I know, said Leona. I heard him. Did you correct him? No, she said, I did not correct him. Elias laid the Bible down on the bed beside him. He reached out his hand. She took it. They sat like that without speaking while the light in the window changed from afternoon gold to evening blue. 2 weeks passed. Silas Kincaid slept on the floor of the front parlor. He did not sleep well. One morning, Leona came down the stairs and found him at the kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning, his head in his hands. She sat down across from him. She poured him a cup of coffee from the pot Prudence kept warm through the night. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, sometimes I think I can hear my brother's voice. What does it say? She asked. It says, Silas, why are you sitting at this table? Why are you drinking coffee in the house of the woman who killed me? Get up, Silas. Do the thing you came to do. He looked up at her. His eyes were hollow. And what do you say back? She asked quietly. I say, Rufus, I am sorry. I loved you. I loved the brother who taught me to ride. I did not know the other brother. I do not want to know him. And I am staying here. He began to cry soundless into the coffee. Leona reached across the table and she put her large, scarred hand over his young, shaking one. She did not speak. She only waited until the shaking eased and his breathing slowed. "That is your answer," she said. "Hold on to it, Silas. That is the right answer." On the first Sunday of September, Elias Hargrove walked. He walked down the narrow stairs of Widow Merriweather's boarding house on a pine wood cane the old woman's late husband had once used. He walked out the front door into the morning. The air was cool. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the main street had started to turn the color of new wheat. Leona walked beside him. She wore a dress of dark green wool. Widow Prudence Merriweather had worn it herself 40 years before when she had been a young woman in St. Louis. It had been folded in a cedar chest for 4 decades. Prudence had let it out at the shoulders and at the waist. It fit Leona Whitaker as though it had been cut for her. Her hair was done up in a simple braid pinned at the back of her head. She had no veil, no flowers. She carried nothing in her hands. Elias wore a clean white shirt that Widow Merriweather had washed and pressed. His only good coat, the same trail trousers he had ridden in from Ohio. His beard had been trimmed. His gray hair was combed. He looked for the first time in a long time like a man who had decided to stand up straight. The small white church of Pine Hollow sat at the top of a slight rise at the east end of the town. Its steeple caught the morning sun. Reverend Ezra Lancaster was waiting in the open door. Inside the church there were 4 people. Widow Prudence Merriweather in her best black dress with a white lace collar. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks in a brown coat that had seen better days. Silas Kincaid standing alone near the back with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floorboards. And an old woman named Hannah Turnbull, Reverend Lancaster's wife of 49 years, who played the small foot organ. Hannah Turnbull played a hymn as Leona and Elias walked up the aisle. The hymn was "Abide With Me." It was the hymn Elias's mother had hummed over the dishwater when Elias was a boy in Ohio. He did not know that Leona had chosen it. Elias's eyes shone when the music began. Leona felt his hand tighten a little on her arm. She kept walking. They stopped in front of the plain wooden altar. Reverend Lancaster stood behind it. His old Bible lay open on the altar top. "Children," he said. The words settled on them like a blanket. "I have performed 300 weddings in my life," said the Reverend. "I have used the old words, the love and honor words, the sickness and health words. I will not use those words today. Those words are beautiful, but they are for young people who have not yet had their hearts broken. You two have already had your hearts broken. The old words are not quite right for you." He turned a page of the old wet Bible. "Today," he said, "the Lord is not asking you to promise to love one another forever. Love is the Lord's business. He gives it. He grows it. It is not for you to promise it into being. What the Lord is asking of you today is simpler than that, and harder." He looked at Elias. "Elias Hargrove," said Reverend Lancaster, "do you promise before God and before these witnesses that you will keep walking through the good days and the hard days, through the days of faith and the days of doubt, that you will not leave this woman's side?" "I do," said Elias, "I promise." The Reverend turned to Leona. "Leona Whitaker," he said, "do you promise before God and before these witnesses that you will keep walking beside this man, through his wounds and through yours, that you will not run, that you will stay?" "I do," said Leona, "I promise." "Then by the authority given to me," said Reverend Lancaster, "I pronounce you man and wife." Elias Hargrove reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He took out the small gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. He lifted Leona's left hand. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit. Both of them saw it fit. Both of them understood what that meant. He did not kiss her on the mouth. It was not that kind of wedding. He lifted her hand instead and he kissed her on the back of her hand the way a man kisses the hand of a woman he has respected all his life. And then she bent her head forward and he bent his head forward, and their foreheads touched, and they stood that way for a count of 3 while the organ went quiet. It was Silas Kincaid in the back of the church who wept the hardest. Widow Prudence Merriweather laid out a small supper in her kitchen that evening. There was a roast chicken, there were fresh biscuits, there was a small dark cake she had baked herself the day before. Silas Kincaid stood up from his chair when the plates were cleared away. He held a tin cup of water. He looked at Leona and Elias across the table, and his young face was red. "I want to say something," he said. Everyone looked at him. "2 weeks ago," said Silas Kincaid, "I came to this country to kill this woman. I rode from Fort Bowie with the intention of putting a bullet through her back. I fired a rifle at her in the main square of Dus Creek. I fired a rifle at her in a canyon 3 days out. I missed both times. I know now that the Lord made me miss." He swallowed. "I am sitting at a wedding supper," he said, "for the woman I came to kill. I am eating her wedding cake. I do not know what to call it. The Lord works in strange ways is all I can think to say." Reverend Lancaster laughed. It was a short, warm laugh. "Son," he said, "that is the best definition of the Lord I have heard in a long time. Sit down, eat more cake." Silas Kincaid sat down. He ate more cake, and when he thought nobody was watching, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. 2 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, a man rode into Pine Hollow from the south. He was not from the county. Prudence Merriweather had lived in Pine Hollow for 34 years. She knew every rider who belonged. This one did not belong. He was 40 years old, maybe 45. He wore a black coat that was too heavy for the September heat. He wore a flat-brimmed black hat pulled low. He wore 2 revolvers, one on each hip. His horse was a tall, mean-looking bay that had been ridden hard for a long time. He swung down in front of the general store across the street. He tied the bay to the rail. He walked across to Widow Merriweather's porch. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I wonder if you might help me." Prudence Merriweather stopped sweeping. She leaned on her broom. "I will if I can," she said. "I am looking," said the man in the black coat, "for a tall woman." "Tall for a woman, I mean." 6 feet or close to it, yellow hair. She will be traveling with a man, a cowboy. The cowboy will be carrying a fresh wound, likely in the leg. Have you had guests like that in your house in the last 2 or 3 weeks? Prudence Merriweather did not blink. Her face did not change. "No," she said. "I have not had guests of that description." "Are you sure, ma'am?" "I am sure, mister. I am a very particular woman about who sleeps under my roof. I would remember a tall, yellow-haired woman and a wounded cowboy. I have not seen either of them." The man in the black coat looked at her for a long moment. He had pale eyes, pale and flat and patient. Then he touched the brim of his hat a second time. "Much obliged," he said. "If they do come through, there is a reward posted, $300, dead or alive." Prudence Merriweather smiled at him. Her smile was thin and polite. "I am too old," she said, "to make money in that fashion, mister." "Good day to you." The man in the black coat walked back across the street. He mounted the mean bay. He rode slow up the main street of Pine Hollow, looking at every window as he went. Widow Prudence Merriweather waited until he had turned the corner by the livery stable. Then she leaned the broom against the porch rail. She picked up her skirts, and she ran as fast as a 56-year-old woman can run around to the kitchen door. Leona was at the table shelling peas. Elias was in the chair by the stove, his bad leg propped on a stool. Silas was cleaning his rifle. "A man," she said, out of breath. A man in a black coat. He is looking for the two of you. There is a reward posted. $300, dead or alive. Elias sat up in the chair. His face went very still. $300 dead or alive, said Silas. I know the kind of man who rides for that price. They do not ride alone. There will be two more within a day's ride of the first. Sheriff Vance, said Elias quietly. He has forged papers on her. He does not know the truth has come out in Dus Creek yet. Or he does know and he is racing the truth to the state line. Prudence Merriweather sat down on the wooden chair by the door. You cannot stay here, she said. I wish to God you could stay. But he looked at my face. He will come back. He will bring his friends. We are not asking to stay, said Elias. We will go. Tonight. Silas took his rifle back up off the table. There is a trail, he said, over the mountain. It is not on any map. The Army surveyed it once in '73. It was never marked. It goes north into the Colorado high country. I rode it once when I was 19. I can find it again. How long, said Elias. 3 weeks, said Silas. Maybe 4 if the weather turns. Elias looked at Leona. Leona looked back at him. Neither of them had to speak. We will take it, said Elias. Reverend Ezra Lancaster came to the boarding house at dusk. He carried a small bundle tied in a blue cloth. Inside were 4 things: a jar of honey from his wife's hive, a round of yellow cheese wrapped in wax paper, a small tin of tea, and a folded slip of paper. The paper had a name written on it in careful script. Reverend Ephraim Caldwell, said Reverend Lancaster. He is the pastor of the small congregation in Silver Valley, Colorado. He is an old friend of mine. We were at seminary together in Philadelphia 44 years ago. You ride up to his door, you give him my name, and he will take care of you. He pressed the slip of paper into Elias Hargrove's hand. Thank you, said Elias. The Reverend put his old hand on Elias's shoulder. You carry that Bible I gave you, he said. I will carry it, said Elias. They left Pine Hollow at 2 o'clock in the morning. The moon was a thin, curved blade low in the west. The main street was empty. Widow Prudence Merriweather stood on the porch of her boarding house in her nightgown and her shawl. Reverend Ezra Lancaster stood beside her. Leona Whitaker came down the porch steps last. She turned back. She climbed the steps and put her arms around Widow Prudence Merriweather. The 2 women stood holding each other for a count of 30. Write to me, said Prudence into Leona's shoulder. I will, said Leona. I will not forget the old woman of Pine Hollow. See that you do not, said Prudence. Silas Kincaid had the horses ready in the alley behind the boarding house. He helped Leona up into the saddle. He helped Elias up after her. They rode out of Pine Hollow on the old Army trail that Silas Kincaid knew. They rode north into the dark. Behind them, one window of one boarding house stayed lit until the 3 riders had disappeared into the pine shadows at the foot of the mountain. Then the window went dark too. The road to Silver Valley had begun. The mountain rose before them for 3 weeks. Silas Kincaid led. He rode in front with his Spencer carbine across the pommel of his saddle. Elias came next, his left leg still stiff, the Winchester in the scabbard under his right knee. Leona rode last, her skirts tucked up around her boots, her long blonde braid pinned under Prudence Merriweather's old felt hat. The trail was everything Silas had said it would be. It was steep. It was cold. In places, it was only the width of a man's shoulders between the rock wall and a drop that fell away into blue nothing. In other places, it was not a trail at all. It was a memory Silas Kincaid carried in his bones from the summer he was 19. The weather turned on the 9th day. Snow came down through the pines in small, hard flakes that did not melt when they touched the ground. By the 11th day, there was 6 inches on the trail. By the 15th day, there was a foot. They did not stop. At night, they built small fires in caves that Silas knew. They shared a single blanket between the three of them because two blankets had been lost when Elias's horse died in the pass. They ate the bread and cheese Reverend Lancaster had given them, and when that was gone, they ate dried beef and rabbits that Silas shot with his Spencer. They drank melted snow from a tin pot. One night, somewhere above timberline, in a hollow of red rock, where an old bighorn sheep had died a year before, and its white bones still lay scattered in the dirt, Leona slept with her head on Elias's shoulder. She did not plan it. She had been sitting beside him, wrapped in her half of the blanket, and her eyes had closed, and when she woke just before dawn, she found that her cheek had come to rest against the rough wool of his coat, and that his arm had come around her, and that he had not moved because he had not wanted to wake her. She did not move away. Silas Kincaid on the other side of the fire pretended to be asleep. He had been awake for an hour. He was smiling to himself in the dark. On the morning of the 22nd day, they crested the last pass. Below them, green and wide and soft in the morning light, lay Silver Valley. It was a bowl cupped between the high peaks. A river ran through the middle of it in a silver line. Meadows spread out on either bank, the grass still wet with the first frost. There was a small white church with a steeple. There were 8, maybe 10 log houses scattered through the valley floor. Smoke rose from 3 of the chimneys. Cattle grazed in a far pasture. The high peaks behind the valley were already white with autumn snow. Leona Whitaker drew in a long breath. I did not know, she said, that a place like this still existed. I thought the world only had Dus Creek in it. Elias smiled. It was the second real smile she had seen on his face. The Hargrove homestead, he said, is on the east side, under that stand of aspens. You can see the roof from here, see? She followed his hand. She saw a cabin with a sagging roof, a tumbled-down barn, a crooked fence, 40 acres of grass going to seed. It is not much, he said. It is enough, she said. They rode down into the valley on the last day of September, 1878. Reverend Ephraim Caldwell was waiting in the doorway of his little parsonage beside the white church before they had even dismounted. A boy had run up from the river to tell him that riders were coming over the pass. Reverend Caldwell had read the handwriting of his friend Ezra Lancaster on the folded note that Elias held out to him before Elias even spoke a word. Ezra Lancaster's friends said, Reverend Caldwell are my friends. Come in. My wife has stew on the stove. You look like you have not sat at a table in a month. They had not. They ate stew at Reverend Caldwell's kitchen table. Mrs. Caldwell, a small, round woman with white hair, filled their bowls 3 times. When Leona tried to thank her, Mrs. Caldwell waved it away. Do not thank me, she said. Thank the Lord. He has clearly been busy on your behalf. Reverend Caldwell walked with them to the Hargrove homestead the next morning. He brought 2 neighbors with him, a man named Seamus O'Brennan from County Cork, who had come west after the famine and who had 6 grown children in the valley, and a man named Nils Lindqvist, who had come from Sweden 10 years before, and who could split a log so straight you could set a book on it. Both men looked at the cabin. They looked at the barn. They looked at each other. They did not speak for a long time. Then Seamus O'Brennan said in the sing-song lilt of County Cork, Well now, Mr. Hargrove, it is a fine bit of timber under all the rot. A fine bit indeed. We will have you a proper roof before the snow comes. Nils Lindqvist nodded once. He did not say much, ever. The whole valley came. By the 2nd week of October, the old cabin roof was gone and a new one stood in its place. The barn had 4 new corner posts and a full set of rafters. The stove had been reseated on a stone hearth. The broken window in the kitchen had been replaced with a pane of real glass that Reverend Caldwell had ordered by wagon from Denver. Elias Hargrove stood on the porch on the evening the last shingle was nailed down. His left leg still dragged a little when he walked, but he stood on his own. He watched his new neighbors walking down across the meadow toward their own homes, their long shadows stretching out in front of them in the October light. Seamus O'Brennan carried a hammer. Niels Lindqvist carried a bag of nails. Reverend Caldwell carried his Bible the way other men carry their hats. Elias turned to Leona, who was standing beside him. "I did not know," he said, "that people like this still existed. I thought the world only had Dus Creek in it." It was her own line given back to her. She smiled. It was the first full smile of her life as Leona Hargrove. "I thought the same," she said. The first winter was hard. The snow came early. By the middle of November, the pass Silas Kincaid had brought them over was closed until spring. By the end of December, drifts stood shoulder high against the north wall of the cabin. The wind came down out of the high peaks at night and spoke a language that had no words in it. They had laid in enough wood. They had laid in enough hay for the 2 milk cows Niels Lindqvist had sold them at half price. They had flour and salt and sugar, and a barrel of dried apples. They had each other. Silas Kincaid slept in the loft. Elias and Leona slept in the one bed in the back room. They slept like brother and sister at first. Elias laid his blankets on the floor beside the bed for the first 6 weeks. Leona lay in the bed with her hands folded on her chest and her eyes open for a long time after he had blown out the candle, and she could hear him breathing on the boards at her feet, and she could not decide whether she wanted to speak or not. On the first night of December, she spoke. "Elias," she said. "Yes, come up off the floor." There was a silence. "Leona," he said, "you do not have to. I know what I do not have to do," she said. "I am telling you what I want. Come up off the floor. This is your house. This is your bed. I am your wife. Lie in your own bed. There is room on your side and there is room on mine, and we are grown people. We do not have to do more than sleep under the same blanket." Elias Hargrove climbed into the bed. He lay very still on his side. His hands were at his sides. His back did not touch her back. There was a full foot of cold sheet between them. Leona laughed in the dark. It was a small, tired laugh, but it was a laugh. "You may breathe, Mr. Hargrove," she said. "I will not break." He breathed. He laughed a little too. Then, slow like a man approaching a skittish horse, he slid one hand across the cold sheet and he laid it on top of hers. And he did not hold her hand. He only laid his palm flat over the back of her fingers, and he left it there. They slept that way. It was enough. For that night, it was enough. The other nights came and the other nights passed. One night, a month later, she turned over in her sleep, and she woke to find her face pressed against the hollow of his throat and his arm around her shoulder. And she did not know who had moved first, and she did not care. On the night of Easter Sunday, 1879, Leona Hargrove came to her husband as a wife comes to a husband for the first time. Nothing more will be said of that night. It does not belong to anyone but them. It is enough to say that it was tender and it was slow and it was not a taking. It was a giving in both directions by two people who had not believed they would ever give that gift again. And when it was over, Leona Hargrove lay with her head on Elias Hargrove's chest, and she wept quietly, and he held her. And neither of them said a word because no word was needed. On the morning of May the 12th, 1879, a rider came over the pass. He was not a bounty hunter. He was a young man in a gray cloth cap riding a mule with a canvas mail sack slung across his shoulder. He had come up from Denver by stage, and then by horse, and then by mule. He was the first mail rider to make it into Silver Valley since the previous October. He had one letter for the Hargrove homestead. It was a thick letter. It was sealed with red wax. The return address in a young man's careful hand read, Jasper Vance, Dust Creek, Arizona Territory. Leona Hargrove sat down on the porch step to open it. Elias sat down beside her. Silas stood behind them with his hat in his hands. Jasper Vance had written 3 pages. Leona read them aloud, slow, her voice catching in the places her voice wanted to catch. Mr. Hargrove, the letter began. I hope this finds you and Mrs. Hargrove alive and well. I pray it does. I have had no way of knowing all this winter whether you made it through, but I imagine you did because I have come to think you are not a man easily killed. There is news from Dus Creek. I will tell it in order. 2 weeks after you left, a man from Denver came through town on a stagecoach. His name is Ezra Fieldstone. He writes for the Denver Tribune. He had heard about the iron cage from a traveler who had passed through our town in July. He had not believed the story. He came to see it for himself. He saw the empty cage in our square. He asked questions. Dr. Obadiah Thorne went to Mr. Fieldstone's hotel room on the evening of the 2nd day. I do not know what the 2 men said to each other, but at 6 o'clock the next morning, Mr. Fieldstone was on the stagecoach back to Denver with a written and signed and witnessed statement from Dr. Thorne containing the truth of every part of what happened in the alley behind the Broken Spoke on the night of May the 14th, 1878. The full truth, including the bargain my father forced on the doctor. The Denver Tribune printed the story in 5 parts over 5 days. It was reprinted in the Phoenix Republican. It was reprinted in the Tucson Star. It was reprinted in newspapers as far east as St. Louis and as far west as San Francisco. The name of my father began to be written in print next to words I cannot put in a letter to a lady. In February, a United States Marshal came to Dus Creek from Yuma. He arrested my father in his own office. He arrested him for embezzlement of public funds, for tampering with a witness under oath for conspiracy to commit murder, and for the abuse of his office. My father did not resist. I think he had been waiting for this day since the morning you rode out of the square. The trial was held in Phoenix in March. I was a witness for the prosecution. Dr. Thorne was a witness for the prosecution. So were Ruth Collins and Arthur Pike and Emma Whitley's mother, whose name is Sarah Whitley. My father was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years at the Territorial Prison at Yuma. He is there now. I am told the prison is a hard place. I do not visit him. I may visit him one day. I do not know yet. There is more. Dr. Obadiah Thorne passed away on the 12th of April. His heart. He had asked me to write to you if it happened. I am writing now. He left a sealed envelope for Mrs. Hargrove. I am sending it inside this letter. He said that what he had to say to her was in that envelope and that he would leave it to her whether she ever opened it. There is more still. Mrs. Hargrove's name has been cleared. The governor of the Arizona Territory signed the pardon in March. It is more than a pardon, really. It is a formal acknowledgement that she was the victim of a crime and that she acted in defense of her own life. There is no warrant on her. There is no bounty. The papers my father forged after you left have all been withdrawn. I have been elected to the Dus Creek Town Council. I am 19 going on 20. I am the youngest man ever to sit on the council. It seems strange to me, too. The council voted in February to tear down the iron cage. We did it in one afternoon. We used the iron to make a bell for the new schoolhouse. The schoolhouse is now real. It opens in September. I do not ask the 2 of you to come back. Dus Creek does not deserve Mrs. Hargrove. I do not know if it deserves anyone yet, but I wanted you to know what happened after you left. I wanted you to know that some things were set right. Not all of them. Never all of them. But some. I remain your friend, Jasper Vance. Leona stopped reading. She folded the 3 pages. She laid them in her lap. She did not speak for a long time. Then she opened the second envelope, the one that had been sealed by Dr. Obadiah Thorne. She read it alone at the end of the porch with her back turned to Elias and Silas. She read it 3 times. When she was done, she walked back into the cabin and she opened the iron door of the stove and she dropped the letter onto the coals and she watched it burn until there was nothing left. Elias said, "You did not keep it." "I did not need to keep it," said Leona. "He wrote what he needed to write. I read what I needed to read. I do not need paper to remember." She walked back out onto the porch. She sat down on the step beside her husband. The sun was going down behind the far peaks of the range. The snow on the high ground had turned pink. "Elias," she said. "Yes, I want to build them." "Who?" "Barney and Adeline and your boy. I want to build them markers on the hill behind the cabin so they can look down on our valley. So when I am old, I can walk up there and sit with them. So when you are old, you can too." Elias Hargrove took his wife's hand. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will start." They built the markers in the last week of June. Silas helped. Seamus O'Brennan brought a plane and a chisel. Nils Lindqvist brought a pine board he'd been saving in his loft for 3 years, a board so clear and straight it rang like a bell when you tapped it. They built 2 markers. The first marker said, "Barnabas Whitaker, beloved husband, blacksmith of Dus Creek, 1850 to 1878. She is a gift from God." The second marker said, "Adeline Hargrove, beloved wife and our son, never named, always loved, 1852 to 1876. Faith is walking on even without answers." They set the 2 markers on the top of the hill behind the cabin, side by side, 10 feet apart with their faces toward the valley. There were no bodies beneath them. The bodies were in Arizona and Ohio and ground. These 2 would never visit again. But the markers stood. They climbed the hill together on the morning of the 1st of July, 1879. The sun was just breaking over the eastern peaks. The grass on the hill was wet. Their boots left dark trails through the dew. Leona knelt before the marker that said Barnabas Whitaker. "Barney," she said out loud in her ordinary voice, the voice she used when she was talking to him in the shop 10 years ago. "Barney, I have brought you here. I could not carry you in my arms out of that ground in Dus Creek, but I carried you in another way. I carried your name. I carried your words. I carried the way you looked at me across the anvil on the afternoon we first met." She took a breath. "I am married again," she said. "His name is Elias. He is a good man. He is a patient man. He is afraid of the same God you were not afraid of. But I am going to teach him, or maybe he will teach me. I do not know yet which of us is the slower learner." She smiled, a wet smile. The tears were running now, but not hard. "You were right," she said. "I was a gift from God. You told me that when I did not believe it. You told me that when I could not say it back to myself. I did not believe you for a long while after you died. 3 months in an iron cage, a ride through red canyons, a winter on a high bench in Colorado. It took all of that for me to begin to believe you again. But I am beginning." She laid her hand flat on the wood. "I love you," she said. "I will always love you, and I am not asking your permission to love another man because you already gave it to me the night you died. You told me not to let the world make me less. Loving Elias does not make me less. It is making me more. Rest easy, Barney." She kissed the wood of the marker. Then she stood up. She stepped back. She let Elias walk forward. Elias Hargrove knelt before the marker that said Adeline Hargrove. He did not speak right away. His throat was working. A muscle was jumping at the side of his jaw. Leona stood back and she let him have his time. "Adeline," he said at last. It came out as a whisper. "Adeline, I am sorry it took me so long." He closed his eyes. "I have been angry for 2 years. I have been angry with God. I have been angry with the sky and the road and the bottle and every open grave I have ridden past. I have been angry with myself for not being there the night you died. I have been angry with you sometimes for dying. I did not know I was angry with you until last winter, and then I was ashamed, and then I was angry at the shame too. I have been an angry man, Adeline. You would not have recognized me." He opened his eyes. "I prayed last night, first time in 2 years and 8 months. I did not ask for anything. I only said thank you. Thank you for Leona. Thank you for this valley. Thank you for the second breath you gave me when I was sure I was done breathing. And I asked him to tell you something, if he sees fit to pass it along. I asked him to tell you that when you meet our son on the other side, you should hold him for me every day, because I cannot, and you can. Tell him his daddy is sorry he never got to hold him, but his daddy thinks about him every day. His daddy thinks about him in the morning when the coffee is on. His daddy thinks about him at night when the stars come out. His daddy will keep thinking about him until the day his daddy walks up a hill just like this one and sees you on the other side and hands you this tired old heart back. Rest easy, Adeline." He kissed the wood of the marker. He stood up. Leona was beside him. She took his hand. She did not speak. They stood on the hill in the morning sun, and they looked down over Silver Valley, which was their valley now, and they did not speak for a long time. Down at the foot of the hill, Reverend Ephraim Caldwell had walked up from the church. He stood on the grass below them, far enough away that he could not hear a word they said. He took off his hat. He bowed his head. He prayed his own prayer for them silently, and he did not climb the hill because the hill that morning belonged only to them. The summer of 1879 passed. Then the fall, then another winter easier than the first. In the spring of 1880, Silas Kincaid asked Elias Hargrove if he might speak to him for a minute. They walked out to the fence line together. Elias said, "Silas, I have met a girl. Her name is Gwendolyn O'Brennan. She is Seamus O'Brennan's youngest daughter. I have been walking her home from Sunday service for 3 months. I would like to ask her to marry me. But first I would like to ask you something." "All right," said Elias. "Would you stand up as my father said, Silas, at the wedding? My own father died when I was 9. You are the nearest thing to a father I have left. I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would walk me up the aisle and hand me off." Elias Hargrove, who had buried one son before the son had even been named, did not answer for a long time. His throat had closed. He stood at the fence and he looked out over the valley and he fought for his voice. When his voice came back, he said, "Son." He said it and he did not say any more for a moment. "Son," he said again. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." Silas Kincaid and Gwendolyn O'Brennan were married on the afternoon of June the 8th, 1880, in the little white church of Silver Valley. Reverend Ephraim Caldwell performed the ceremony. Elias Hargrove walked Silas up the aisle and handed him off to his bride. Leona Hargrove stood up with Gwendolyn as her matron of honor. Seamus O'Brennan wept through the whole ceremony into a handkerchief the size of a saddle blanket, and everyone pretended not to notice. Silas and Gwendolyn built a cabin on the east end of the Hargrove land along the creek. The Kincaid cabin. Silas became the foreman of the Hargrove cattle operation, which was now 20 head and growing. Gwendolyn started a herb garden. In February of the next year, their first child came, a little red-haired girl they named Adeline Prudence Kincaid. Nobody who knew the story could say those two names together without having to look at the floor for a moment. In October of 1880, Leona Hargrove told her husband that she was carrying a child. Elias sat down on the porch step, and he did not stand up again for 10 minutes. When he could speak, he said, "Leona, I do not think my heart can stand it if something happens. I know," she said, "mine cannot either. So we will not let anything happen." She took his hand. She laid it flat on her belly. "We will be afraid," she said, "and we will walk on anyway. Because Adeline was right. That is all faith is." The winter of 1880 to 81 was the most carefully guarded winter of Leona Hargrove's life. She did not lift a hay bale. She did not chop a stick of wood. Elias and Silas did every piece of heavy work. Mrs. O'Brennan came down the valley 3 times a week with broth and bread and advice. Reverend Caldwell's wife knit a set of baby clothes and brought them over wrapped in tissue paper. Prudence Merriweather, all the way down in Pine Hollow, sent a package on the first thaw. Inside were 6 tiny gowns she had sewn herself and a letter that ran to 7 pages. The baby came on the 11th of June, 1881. It was a girl. She was born healthy, and she was born loud, and she weighed 8 pounds and 6 ounces. Leona named her Ruth Adeline Hargrove. Ruth, after the woman in the book of Ruth, who followed her mother-in-law into a strange country and said, "Whither thou goest, I will go." Adeline, because when Leona had lain beside the sick bed of Elias Hargrove in Pine Hollow, 2 years and 10 months before she had promised a dead woman that she would never forget her. And she had not, and she would not. Elias Hargrove held his daughter for the first time on the afternoon of her birth. He held her for nearly an hour before he let anyone else near her. He did not weep. He only stared at her and stared at her and stared at her as if he could not quite believe she was real. When he finally laid her in Leona's arms, he kissed Leona on the forehead and he said, "You have given me back my life." The years rolled on. Samuel Obadiah Hargrove was born in 1883, a strong, serious boy named for Reverend Caldwell and for the old doctor who had finally told the truth. Barnabas Seamus Hargrove, called Barney for short, came in 1885, and the first time Leona called his name out the kitchen door for supper, her voice caught and she had to lean on the doorframe for a moment. Little Prudence Hargrove, the baby, was born in the spring of 1887, and she was named for the old woman of Pine Hollow, who by then was 70 years old and who cried when she read the letter announcing the birth. 4 children, a working ranch, a community of neighbors who had become family. In July of 1882, a telegram came up from Dus Creek. Sheriff Cornelius Vance had died in the territorial prison at Yuma. Consumption, the same illness that had taken Barney Whitaker. He had asked on his deathbed that his son Jasper send word to Mrs. Hargrove and that she be invited to his funeral if she wished to come. Leona read the telegram twice. She folded it. She looked at Elias. "I do not go for him," she said. "I go for Jasper." They went. Leona was 5 months along with Samuel. They took little Ruth, who was 22 months old, on the new rail line that had finally reached southern Arizona. At the graveside, under a flat-hammered sky, Jasper Vance handed Leona Hargrove a sealed letter. She opened it there at the foot of the grave, and she read the single line her former tormentor had written to her. "I was wrong. I am sorry. Not because I deserve forgiveness, because you deserve not to carry me." Leona Hargrove took the letter. She folded it once. She laid it on the fresh dirt of Cornelius Vance's grave. She struck a match. She burned the letter to gray ash. She did not speak. On the train going home with Ruth asleep on her lap and Samuel kicking in her belly and Elias's hand resting on her shoulder, Leona said, "I have forgiven him." "Not for him," she said. "For me. because I am not going to carry him back to Silver Valley with me." Elias Hargrove kissed the top of her head. The train rolled north, 1887, 9 years after the Iron Cage. Leona Hargrove was 37 years old. Elias Hargrove was 42. Their 4 children were 7 and 5 and 3 and 6 months. The Hargrove Ranch ran 200 head of cattle on 200 acres of leased and owned grass. Elias was one of the 3 most respected cattlemen in Silver Valley. Leona was the woman Mrs. Caldwell came to when any woman in the valley was in labor because Leona had large, strong hands and the best nerve of any midwife west of Denver. Silas Kincaid and Gwendolyn had 3 children of their own now in the Kincaid cabin across the creek. One evening in August, Elias and Leona sat on the porch of their home as the sun went down behind the western peaks. Ruth, age 7, sat on the porch boards with her little brother Samuel, reading aloud to him from a school primer. Barney, age 3, was chasing a brown puppy in circles in the dooryard. The baby Prudence slept in a cradle at her mother's foot. Elias took his wife's hand. "Leona," he said, "do you know what day this is?" "I know a lot of days," she said. "Which one are you thinking of?" "9 years ago today," said Elias, "I rode into Dus Creek. I was on my way to this valley. I had $7 in my pocket and 500 in gold under my coat, and I had no intention of stopping for anything on the road. It was only going to be a town where I bought flour. That is all." Leona smiled. She knew this story. He had told it to her 7 times 1 on each of the last 7 anniversaries. "I remember," she said. "I want to thank you," he said, again, "for saying yes. You already thanked me." "I want to thank you every year I am above ground," said Elias, "because every year I am above ground is a year I was not above ground before I met you. Before you, Leona Hargrove, I was a dead man walking. You gave me my body back." Leona lifted his hand. She kissed the back of it the way he had kissed hers at the altar in Pine Hollow. "Elias," she said, "do you know what you gave me?" "What?" "You gave me the chance to be a gift from God again." They sat on the porch. The sun kept sinking. Ruth's voice rose and fell reading her school book. Barney caught the puppy and sat down in the grass laughing. Far off, a bell rang at the Silver Valley Church for evening prayer. From the hill behind the cabin, 2 markers looked down on them in the pink light. The narrator's voice speaks now from a long way off, from a place where the story has already ended. Leona Whitaker Hargrove lived to be 72 years old. She passed in the winter of 1922 in the bed she had shared with her husband for 44 years with her children and her grandchildren around her. Elias followed her 3 months later at the age of 78 in the spring of 1923. They say he died of a broken heart, but those who knew him thought that he just did not wish to stay in a world she had walked out of. They were buried on the hill behind the cabin. 4 markers now stood there side by side: Barnabas Whitaker, Adeline Hargrove, Leona Hargrove, Elias Hargrove. Their children had children. Ruth Adeline Hargrove became the first school teacher of the new Silver Valley School, which was built in 1898. Samuel Obadiah Hargrove became a Methodist minister in Denver. Barney took over the ranch. Little Prudence grew up and married one of Silas Kincaid's sons, and in that way 2 families that had once begun as enemies became in the end one family with 1 set of grandchildren. None of those grandchildren knew as grown men and women the story of the iron cage at Dus Creek. Leona would not speak of it. Elias respected her silence. The story was buried with them. But on certain afternoons when the wind came down off the high peaks and moved through the long grass on the hill behind the cabin, it was said in the valley that you could hear 4 voices up there very low, talking quietly among themselves the way old friends talk when there is nothing left to settle. Leona Whitaker Hargrove was not in the end the woman in the iron cage. She became herself, and that was the largest victory of her life. It was a victory that no cage and no sheriff and no town and no lie could take from her. And if you are a man who has known grief, who has buried someone you loved, who has sat at your own fire and wondered whether the Lord remembers your name, hear this. The life you think is over is not over. It has only changed its shape. And sometimes on a road, you were not planning to travel on a day you were only going to buy flour. The best part of your life is waiting for you in a place you never expected to stop. The Lord is patient. He does not forget a soul.